Good afternoon again, everyone. Thankful for you and your willingness to tune in and continue to study the Word of God with us. And today we continue on with what we introduced on Tuesday as we sort of reached into the history of the time of Daniel, and we made the connection. And I encourage you to go back and listen and rewatch that one again to sort of get in your mind sort of the historical picture that we are discussing here. We're going to do that in just a moment. We're going to move into the story of Esther today, and I'm excited about that. I want to get to that in just a moment. Just a reminder, we've continued to remind you each and every time. If you will, please send us those pictures, and we'd like to put that together as soon as possible. For our 3rd through 6th graders, some questions from our lesson on Tuesday. Number 1, how many years did the Lord say it would take before he would bring his people back from Babylon? We went and looked at a couple of different passages, one out of Jeremiah, some from Ezra. But in the one in Jeremiah, in chapter 29, it spoke of a prophecy given by Jeremiah, and he listed a specific amount of time, specific number of years. Number 2, what prophet remained in Judah after the exile? Again, that was a part of our discussion, sort of the overlap between this prophet and Daniel. Who was the king that declared that the Israelites could start returning home? And at the close of that number of years, this particular king was moved in his spirit to allow the Israelites to begin returning home. And then we talked about at the end of our time around what date was the temple finished. In the rebuilding of the temple, obviously. Today we move into a discussion about Esther, and before we can really get into Esther, we have to sort of set the stage and paint a picture for you, because truthfully, the story of Esther, while her story is absolutely amazing and phenomenal and inspiring and uplifting and encouraging, it doesn't have that level of influence without some of the things that you need to understand about the days that we're talking about here. Now we're about 30 years removed from the temple being finished. You still have Xerxes is now the king, and Xerxes is sort of the man in charge from India to Ethiopia. He reigned over 127 provinces. We'll go ahead and put that up there. And you'll see Ahasuerus, but basically it's the same person, Ahasuerus or Xerxes. The name is sort of inconsequential here. It's just that this is who you're talking about. But he's in a particular place. He's in Susa, which is the citadel. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave this gigantic feast. Now let's pause just for a second. Let's make sure we understand. We're 30 years removed from the finishing of the temple. Daniel is now gone. Jeremiah has been gone for quite some time. And truthfully, the Israelites are sort of an in-between here. They're not really fully committed to being back home. You still have many who have decided to stay. A part of what would now be the Persian Empire. If you remember all the way back several lessons ago, we talked about what Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar about the statue and the different kingdoms that would follow, and we're now into that Medes and Persians group, and we're with the Persians now. Xerxes is in charge, and that's his group, and that's who he's in charge of. And there's a lot of Jews that chose to stay in different areas of the former Babylonian Empire that they had been exiled to and now belonged to the Medes and Persians. They had basically built themselves a life there. And for many families, they felt as though rather than load up and move back to a place that to them, and let's just be honest, let's call it what it is, to them represented a lot of sadness and destruction. Rather than move back to Jerusalem, they just simply stayed where they were. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but you do need to understand sort of the mindset that they had become sort of integrated into these different groups in the Medes and the Persians. And that's going to be part of the issue that Haman, who we'll talk about later on, that's going to be part of the issue that Haman has, is to him, the Jews would have been much like the way the Jews themselves looked at the Samaritans later on. They were outsiders. They didn't belong. They didn't fit. And to Haman, it was time to get rid of them. We'll of course cover that more in detail later on. But at the close of our lesson Tuesday, we sort of gave you sort of a teaser, I guess you'd say, or an introduction to what we were going to kind of aim at. And that is because there is one man specifically that we focus on, we center on because of this story of Esther. And that's a man named Mordecai. And Mordecai chose to remain in Susa with his adopted family, basically. And his adopted family is this young lady that was kin to him, but not his daughter, but basically was his daughter. And you kind of understand their relationship there. It's like an adopted daughter. And that, of course, is Esther. And we're going to sort of follow her story. But again, let's get back on our page here and let's understand sort of the foundation of this discussion. Okay, so there's a giant party being thrown by Ahasuerus or Xerxes. This is in the 3rd year of his reign. The army of Persian Media, the nobles, the governors of provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. If you think about that, I mean, 180 days is a long time to do anything. We constantly are reminding our children of how long the school year is. And that's approximately, give or take, depending on if they're out a couple of days or something, kids go to school approximately 180 days. And we cover that, of course, we have weekends out and those sort of things. But you think about that, 180 days that he is throwing this grand party just to show off, just to show how powerful and wonderful and incredible his kingdom is. 180 days. Now, when that's over, he's got a smaller group that he sort of brings in. A feast, this giant feast. It's still a huge number of people, but it's kind of, he sort of limits it to a certain group of people for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So we're talking about, this is a smaller group. It's sort of brought in to really sort of make connections for him in a political sense, a military sense, a social sense. He's making moves here when he has this feast. And on the 7th day, this is skip down to verse 10 of Esther chapter 1. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, so he's drunk. Let's just call it what he is. He's drunk. He commands these men, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of him. He said, you go get Queen Vashti, and you put her crown on her, and you tell her to come out here, and I want her to dance around, and I want her to show off how pretty she is. In other words, it's a really awkward thing. Let's just be honest and transparent about it. It's incredibly awkward. This is a violation of your wife's privacy. It's a violation of how you should care for your wife, how you should protect your wife. It's a violation of those things. It's a violation, really, truthfully, of your marriage covenant. He's not wanting her to come out and socialize and sit down and communicate. No. He wants her to come out and to show off how pretty she is. It's an insult to her intelligence. It's an insult to all women. It's an insult to their intelligence. To say basically, this is what he says in theory, you're not worth anything other than your good looks. So let's be honest and let's think about that. If you were put in this situation, ladies that are listening tonight, if you were put in that position, you would stand up for yourself. I really hope. And men, if you're listening to this, I pray to God you would never, ever, in any way, shape, or form, consider this okay to do. It's an insult. It's an absolute insult. And she doesn't stand for it. Give her credit. Verse 12, Queen Vashti refused to come at the kingdom's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. It's really sad, and I don't know what the right word is for it, but it's disgusting, I guess. It's the only word that I can think of that truly fits this. He's embarrassed is what he is. It's disgusting that he even thought this was a good idea, first and foremost, but second of all, he's embarrassed because he's been called on his terrible behavior. Now, here's what I don't want to give away kind of what our point is at the end, so let's just move on. So here's one of these men says, and speaks up and decides he's going to be the one sort of be the voice of reason, and I use that very loosely. It's insulting. This Memucan said in the presence of the king, the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes. The queen's behavior will be made known to... Now, pay attention now. I want you to really pay attention. Listen to how chauvinistic this is, how sexist this is. The queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus, commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come, this very day the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials. There will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. Let the king give her royal position to another who is, watch it, better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. That makes my skin crawl. I will just be completely and totally upfront with you. It makes my skin crawl to think that there are men out there who even think this way. And sadly, guess what? There are men right now who still think this way, who still believe that they're women, and to refer to your wife that way with that sort of, because you can read into what he's saying. It's these women ought to be beneath us men. That's what he's saying. And to think that there are men out there even to this day who treat their wives that way. Now, I am not telling you for one second that the men should not be the leaders of the home. They absolutely should. That's not a discussion that we're even having right now. The discussion that we're having right now is the way in which these men looked at women is a violation of how God demands his men and his sons, if you will, to look at women. It's a violation, and it's disturbing, it's disgusting. And the truth is, the advice pleased the kings and the princes. Of course it did. It makes them feel in some sort of way on a pedestal and higher than they ought to. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. It's that phrase, be master in his own household. They're not talking about the biblical model of manliness or the biblical model of male leadership in the home. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying you should rule with an iron fist because you are a man. Everyone should bow down before you, and that's just not fair. It's not right, and it's not biblical. It's not godly. So here's what you have to understand. Before you can get into the story of Esther, you have to know what set the stage for God's intervention. And really, it's these two people. It's this man and wife. Vashti first. Let's talk about Vashti first. Let's go with the positive here first. Vashti paid the price for her stand against the king. She stood up for herself, and not only for herself, but for women everywhere. Although she was a rightful queen, she's deposed at the whim of her husband. Her husband's mad at her. He's angry at her because he feels embarrassed. And truthfully, I don't know Xerxes' heart there. Maybe he did feel bad for putting his wife in that position. I don't know. It would be unfair to say for sure, but I will tell you this. He doubled down on his embarrassment when he deposed her. Because there's no way he could ever believe himself to be a true leader if he really understood leadership. The truth is, this is the precarious state of women, and men for that matter, in the royal court. You were at the whim of the king. Nobody had any way to battle that. Xerxes' decree that girls from the kingdom be brought into his harem was irrefutable. The girls and their families had no say in the matter. If the king said, I want her to come to this house and live here, then the family had no choice but to surrender their daughter to the king. Again, you notice how they look at women, how these men looked at women, and it was as property. So first and foremost, let's look at Vashti, and let's think about this being sort of an understated example. I mean, the entire book really is about Esther, and should be. I'm not trying to take away from that, but without Vashti, there is no Esther. That's just the way it is. That's the way the story goes. It's the way it all falls out. Without Vashti standing up for herself and for women everywhere in that kingdom, by saying, I'm not going to be a piece of property for you anymore. I'm going to be who I'm supposed to be. I'm going to be the queen. I'm going to be respected. I'm going to do what I should do. I'm going to do what I ought to do. And I'm not going to be some sort of plaything or some sort of piece of property. It's not going to happen anymore. Without that, there is no need for Esther. Esther doesn't even come into the picture without Vashti standing up for herself. So I will say this, and I used to say this a lot to teenage groups when I would speak to them, or even to college groups, and it certainly even applies to our adult females. You know what's right and what's wrong, and you know what's expected of you. And if someone, whether it's a man, whether it's another woman, whether it's a boss, whether it's your husband, if they're asking you to break what you know God would have you to be and do, then you need to stand up for yourself, just as Vashti did in this situation. Now, don't be misunderstood. Don't let it be misunderstood. I'm not claiming that Vashti had some sort of godly moment where all of a sudden now she wanted to be a Christian. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I am telling you that in her heart of hearts, she knew as a woman this was not acceptable. And so again, we've used the statement before. It's the testimony of an outsider. In this case, Vashti sets a wonderful example in standing up for yourself when you know something's wrong. Now, the negative side of that is Xerxes. And this is truly setting the stage for God's intervention. The way Xerxes looked at women, the way Xerxes looked at his kingdom, he is now in the same vein, the same boat, if you will, as Nebuchadnezzar before his conversion. If you want to use that term, that's fine. He's now in the same vein as Belshazzar before the handwriting on the wall, which he did not learn from. Xerxes is now in that same vein. He's in that same boat. And the stage is now set for God to intervene. And he's going to do it in one of the more unlikely ways than perhaps we can find in the Old Testament. There's a lot of really amazing examples of God intervening in stories and with people's lives in amazing ways. You think about Balaam, and you think about the donkey beginning to speak. That's phenomenal. It's amazing. It's unexpected. It's miraculous. You think about some of the stories about the judges and Gideon and Samson and some of these other stories, David and David taking down Goliath with a rock and a sling. You think even about Daniel. You think about him using Daniel down in the lion's den to prove a point. But this one is a little bit, it's unique. I'll just use that term. It's unique. What God is going to do through a young lady who honestly is a nobody. As this story begins, Esther's a nobody. Mordecai's a nobody. And before this is all said and done, you're going to talk about a queen and an advisor to the king. And just right now, you just don't see that at the beginning of the story. And that's the amazing thing God can do with a faithful servant. And that's where we'll pick up tomorrow evening. Hopefully you'll tune in and study with us tomorrow evening. I'm thankful for you. And as always, if there's something that we can do through the Rogersville Church of Christ, if something I can do to help you, if there's something you want to talk about, something you want to address or question, please do not hesitate to leave a comment, leave a question, or send us an email. We'll be happy to help you in any way that we can. I hope that you have a blessed evening, and I look forward to continuing our study tomorrow evening.